Mike clutched the second-hand bike tightly as he prepared to set out on his first shift as a food delivery worker. The bike, a worn red model he'd bought with his last savings, was more than just a mode of transportation. It was his lifeline. He glanced down at his son, Leo, 8 years old, whose wide, curious eyes revealed both pride and worry. Leo had asked countless questions about his father's new job, excited by the prospect of stability and the promise of an easier life. Mike had done his best to explain that it was only a start, but one that offered them both a glimmer of hope. "Dad, will you be back soon?" Leo asked softly. Mike knelt down, placing a comforting hand on his son's shoulder. "Yes, Leo. I'll be back by lunch, but you stay inside, all right? Tell your mom to check the phone if I call." Leo nodded, his serious expression a mirror of Mike's own. Though he couldn't fully understand the weight on his father's shoulders, he sensed that today was important. Mike hugged him tightly before mounting the bike and pedaling off down the street. The early morning fog hovered over the city, cool and quiet, as he took his first few turns with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. After months of struggling to find work, of borrowing money and scraping by, this job offered a way forward. The day progressed quickly. Mike moved from one delivery to the next, each order a small but meaningful step toward a better life. He imagined Leo's face when he'd come home later, exhausted but triumphant. With every dollar he earned, he felt one step closer to stability, closer to being the father he wanted to be. It was late morning when he arrived at an old apartment building for his next delivery. He parked his bike by the entrance and, with a twinge of anxiety, locked it to a nearby post. The lock was cheap, one he'd picked up secondhand, but he hoped it would hold. The delivery took only a few minutes, but as he came back down the stairs, he froze. The lock dangled from the post, severed. His bike was gone. Mike's mind raced, his heart pounding as he looked frantically up and down the street. It felt impossible, as if the ground had fallen out from under him. That bike was everything. Without it, he couldn't work, he couldn't provide for Leo or keep his family afloat. For a moment, he stood frozen, unable to accept that the one thing he'd counted on was gone. He pulled out his phone and called his wife, his voice shaking as he explained what had happened. She tried to reassure him, but he could hear the fear in her voice too. He knew he couldn't go home and face Leo with empty hands, so he decided he would search the city. He wouldn't stop until he'd tried everything to get that bike back. Mike returned home briefly, gathering Leo and explaining that they would go on a mission together. The boy was quick to join him, sensing his father's urgency. Mike took his hand, and together, they set off through the city's crowded streets. They started with secondhand shops, hoping that the thief might have sold the bike somewhere nearby. Mike approached each shop owner, his voice a mix of pleading and desperation. "Have you seen a red bike brought in today?" he asked again and again, his heart sinking a bit more with each shake of the head. Leo followed silently, holding his father's hand, his small face mirroring Mike's growing worry. After hours of searching, the city began to feel like a maze with no way out. The frustration grew heavy in Mike's chest, and he couldn't hide it from Leo. He saw his son's concern, the confusion in his young eyes as he watched his father lose hope. Finally, they reached the last shop in the area. Mike approached the shop owner, a middle-aged man with a gruff expression, who listened to his story with a frown. The man looked at Mike, and after a long silence, he nodded. "Might have seen something like that. There's a place nearby where they sometimes sell less legitimate items." He gave Mike directions, a hesitant kindness in his gaze. Mike thanked him and led Leo to the location, a quieter alley with a handful of stalls displaying various goods of questionable origin. Mike's heart pounded as he scanned the area, his eyes darting over the items, searching desperately for any sign of his bike. Finally, he spotted a red bike leaning against a wall, a glimmer of hope breaking through the despair. He hurried over, pulling Leo close as he reached out to inspect it. But as his hands touched the handlebars, his hope crumbled. This bike, though similar, wasn't his. The scratches and dents didn't match. It was just another dead end. Mike's shoulders slumped as he looked down at Leo. The boy's face was full of sympathy, but also confusion. How could he explain the weight of their situation to someone so young, so innocent? As they left the alley, walking slowly back toward the main road. Mike's mind churned with frustration and helplessness. Without the bike, he would lose his job. And without the job, he couldn't provide for Leo. Every part of him felt defeated, but he knew he couldn't give up. Not with his son watching. Just then, across the street, he noticed a row of delivery bikes lined up outside a small cafe. The bikes were locked but unattended, the owners chatting and laughing inside, taking a much-needed break. They were all the same make and model as his own. A simple but sturdy type favored by the delivery workers in the city. A new idea crept into Mike's mind, one he hated himself for even considering. But as he stood there, looking at those bikes, he felt the familiar weight of desperation pressing down on him. Without really thinking, he turned to Leo, his voice low and shaky. "Leo, I need you to wait here for a moment. Over there, in that alley," he pointed to a safe spot nearby. "I'll be right back." Leo looked at him, confused but obedient. "Okay, Dad." He walked to the alley and watched as Mike moved toward the row of bikes. Leo's worry deepened as he saw his father reach for one of the locks, his hands fumbling in a way that seemed wrong. Mike's heart raced as he gripped the lock of one of the bikes. Every part of him was screaming to stop, to think about what he was doing, but the image of Leo's innocent face, his son waiting, hoping for him to find a way to make things right, pushed him forward. He couldn't go back empty-handed, not after everything they'd been through. But just as he started to move the bike, a voice pierced the air. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Mike turned, his heart pounding as he saw a group of delivery workers standing by the cafe entrance, their expressions a mix of anger and disbelief. Panic washed over him as they approached, demanding answers. He stammered, trying to explain, but his words tumbled out in a rush, almost incoherent. One of the men, a tall figure with sharp eyes, grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "You were trying to steal it, weren't you?" Mike struggled, ashamed and terrified. "Please, I just needed a bike. My bike was stolen. I don't know what else to do." But the men weren't listening. They closed in, voices growing louder, and Mike's mind raced, his thoughts spiraling as he braced himself for the worst. At that moment, Leo, who had been watching from the alley, couldn't bear to stay hidden any longer. He ran toward his father, his small face tear-streaked, his voice shaking as he cried, "Please, don't hurt my dad. He didn't mean it." The delivery workers froze, taken aback by the sight of the boy clinging to Mike, fear and innocence radiating from his tearful eyes. One of the workers, an older man with graying hair, looked down at Leo, then back at Mike, his expression softening. "Why would you try to take the bike?" he asked, his tone no longer accusatory but heavy with sympathy. Mike, feeling the shame well up inside him, lowered his head. I'm sorry. My bike was stolen this morning. It's the only way I can work. I have to provide for my son, and I didn't know what else to do. I'm sorry." The workers exchanged looks, a mixture of sympathy and surprise passing between them. They had all faced struggles, each of them knowing too well the desperation that could come with hard times. The older man looked at Mike for a long moment, his gaze softening as he took in the worn lines on Mike's face, the tear-streaked cheeks of little Leo clinging to his father's arm. He let out a sigh, shaking his head, but there was no anger left in his expression. "We've all been there," he said quietly, glancing at the other delivery workers. "Each of us has hit rock bottom before. I get it, but you know stealing's not the answer." Mike nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I know. I'm sorry. I don't have any excuses. I was desperate, but that doesn't make it right." He looked down at Leo, whose worried eyes stared up at him, and he felt a deep shame settle over him. He had nearly crossed a line he never wanted his son to see. The older man seemed to study him for a long moment, and then, with a sigh, he turned to the others. "Listen, maybe there's something we can do. This guy's got a kid to look after, and from the looks of it, he's trying his best." The other delivery workers exchanged glances, their initial anger melting into something more compassionate. One of them, a younger man with a worn delivery bag slung over his shoulder, reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills, handing them over to the older man. "Here," he said quietly. "I can spare a little. Might be enough to get him started." One by one, The other delivery workers followed suit, each adding whatever they could spare. Some offered crumpled bills, others change. The older man collected it all in his hands, creating a modest pile of money before holding it out to Mike. Mike stared at the money, his eyes widening in surprise and disbelief. I can't take this, he stammered, shaking his head. You don't have to do this. The older man pressed the money into Mike's hand, his grip firm but kind. It's not about what we have to do. It's about what we choose to do. You need a bike to get back on your feet. We're not rich, but we know what it's like to be in your shoes. Just take it, and when you're back on your feet, pay it forward. Mike looked down at the money, tears filling his eyes as he clutched it to his chest. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. Thank you, he said, glancing around at each of the men. I swear I'll pay it back. All of it. One of the younger men clapped him on the back with a smile. Just make sure you get back out there. Show that kid of yours how it's done. He nodded toward Leo, who was watching the men with awe and gratitude, his face brightening with hope. The older man pointed him toward a nearby bike shop. They have some decent second-hand bikes. This should cover most of it. Just take care of it, and take care of that kid. Mike nodded, pulling Leo close as he murmured a final, heartfelt thank you to the men before heading toward the shop. Inside, he found a sturdy, second-hand bike with strong tires and reliable pedals. It wasn't new, but it was enough to get him back on the road. With the money from the delivery workers, Mike was able to cover most of the cost of the second-hand bike. As he counted out the bills at the counter, the shop owner placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You don't need to worry about the rest, the owner said with a small smile. My wife was in that cafe when it all happened. She told me about what you went through, about your boy. Just take the bike and pay it forward when you can. Mike's eyes widened, gratitude filling his chest as he held Leo's hand tightly. He nodded, unable to find the words. For the first time that day, he felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The kindness of strangers had given him a second chance, a chance he intended to honor. That evening, Mike sat with Leo at the kitchen table, recounting the events of the day to his wife. She listened, her expression shifting from worry to astonishment as she learned about the generosity of the delivery workers. Leo chimed in excitedly, describing how the men had come together to help his father, his eyes bright with admiration. Mike's wife reached across the table, taking his hand and giving it a squeeze. I'm so glad they were there, she said softly. But please promise me we won't go through this again. Mike nodded, meeting her gaze. I promise. I'll work hard. I'll make it right. He looked down at Leo, who was watching him with a mixture of pride and relief. In that moment, Mike resolved that he would never let his son see him so desperate again. The following weeks were a whirlwind of hard work and determination. Mike kept his promise, showing up for every shift, often working late into the night to earn enough to provide for his family and save a little at a time. The delivery community had heard about his story, and they rallied around him, offering him extra shifts, sharing meals during long breaks, and checking in on him whenever they could. One day, as he was making a delivery near the bike shop, Mike stopped in to see the shop owner, a small amount of cash in his hand. He had been saving a bit from each delivery, and it felt like a triumph to finally return and pay for the bike. The shop owner greeted him with a nod of recognition and accepted the money with a smile. Keep at it, he said, clapping Mike on the back. You're doing good work. Just remember what those men did for you, and keep paying it forward. Mike left the shop feeling a renewed sense of pride, knowing he was fulfilling his promise. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. Riding through the city streets, he felt the breeze against his face, the weight of responsibility mingling with a deep sense of gratitude. Mike knew that he would continue to carry forward the lessons he'd learned, not only for himself, but for everyone around him. The kindness he'd received had been a lifeline, a chance to rebuild. And as he moved forward, he knew that he would always be ready to extend that same lifeline to anyone who needed it. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of resilience and hope. Your support helps us keep bringing these powerful stories to life.